All right, welcome to another episode of Hey Fightin Podcast. Jacob Hester in the Guarantee Studios. Mr. Hester, good to be back in your presence. Get some work done today.
I'm glad to be here because that means football season's close.
It is close.
Like if we're doing Hey Fightin Podcast, that means that we're talking about like actual matchups. We're talking about like depth charts. We're talking about football things and not like what ifs that are like 6 months
Yeah, you've
away.
been doing summer radio for a couple weeks, and you still got a couple weeks of summer radio ahead of you. You hanging in there?
Hanging in there. Like LSU does have like a job search going on right now.
We're giving you all the content.
So that right there, that is good content because that's something that obviously people are passionate about.
Sure.
We have not yet gotten to the Mount Rushmore part of summer radio just yet.
Nice. Yeah, I'm sure the Mount Rushmores are right around the corner. We should do a Mount Rushmores of Mount Rushmores. Like, what's the best Mount Rushmores you've seen? So a couple things that I want to get to today. First of all, I'm calling this two-a-days because we're going to try to record 2 episodes today.
Right.
And it fits. So we're going to try to record a quarterbacks episode, which I did extensive research on. I have numbers. I have so much data to work with. And then we're going to try to do some skill position guys. And I don't have as much data on those guys just because I ran out of time. But
Quarterbacks always get the attention.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a sucker for quarterback stats. It's just where my head goes. So that's what we're going to try to do. Something else we're going to try to do, and this is something I've been spending a lot of time thinking about, like what's the podcast going to look like this fall? How do we get more fan involvement? I did send out an all call for some questions, got some questions that we'll get to on Twitter and on Instagram. But also I'm going to try this new thing. We're going to try it now. All right, we're going to try this live radio style.
Best way to do it.
We're going to try Twitter Spaces, okay? And we're this is something I think might be good for the season. The idea came to me last night as I was sitting there watching the NBA playoffs, and ESPN went live on a Spaces with like Rachel Nichols and like Wale and Stephen A. Smith, like a very random group of people. But it was cool, like that live interactive format, and it got some fan involvement. And I experimented with that a little bit last year with Zoom after the Florida game, had fun with it. So something we might try during the season, maybe as a hurry up after the game, maybe as a pregame show. We'll see. But it's going to allow fans to listen in live and maybe get some live questions, that sort of thing. So I picked a great time, 10:15 on a Wednesday. I'm sure everyone's sitting at their computer waiting to do this and not actually like doing productive work. So good planning by
and doing
by
it
me.
live while we've already started the segment.
Yeah, it's great. So we're real professional operation here. So let's do this, Hester. I'm going to open up my phone.
Okay.
I'm going to start the space. Okay. After I start the space, I'm going to like talk to people that join, like the 6 people that join. Oh, look, Twitter's got this nice, like, I don't know if you can see that on the video or not. It says hop into the app and start your space. Your fans are waiting. We're going to talk quarterbacks today, okay? If you want to ask a question about quarterbacks, raise your hand. I'll try to get to you at some point. Appreciate your patience. And the way I want to format the podcast, the summer podcast, the position previews, is to start in general with big picture, who's gone, who's back, who's new, okay? Right. With quarterbacks, it's kind of obvious. With other positions, I think it's a much more valuable exercise. But for quarterbacks, I think we all know who's gone. TJ Finley is gone from the quarterback room. Right. We'll talk about him in a second. Who is back? Myles Brennan, Max Johnson. It's the story of the summer that everyone wants to know who's going to be your starting quarterback. And we'll touch on that in our own unique Hey Fightin podcast way. And then who's new is Garrett Nussmeier, the freshman quarterback. And so we're going to talk about all those guys in their own form and fashion. I actually want to start with TJ Finley if we can, because he's just transferred out. And to me, it makes for an interesting evolution in college football where, TJ transfers out. He goes to Auburn in conference transfer. Right. That's rare. He's going to be immediately eligible. That's new. So the transfer system in college football has changed, and the era of, the more empowered player is upon us. That's only going to get more empowered with NIL and with the ruling this week in the Supreme Court that sort of gives college athletes a little more leverage moving forward. So I want to start by talking about TJ Finley and your feelings about a guy being at LSU for a year and then transferring in the division to a rival, and what that means on a more large scale for the sport and for college football and for LSU in general, because at the same time, LSU's been a recipient of that with Major Burns coming in from Georgia. And I don't know, I'm having trouble wrapping my head around what it's going to be like for basically the doors to be open for guys to go to one school 1 year and then immediately transfer and be immediately eligible. I support it from a player's perspective, but I see man, I see the complications that emerge there. So what's your reaction to that sort of emergent storyline in college football?
Well, it's almost like free agency in the NFL because look, I'm someone who I spent my entire career in the AFC West. Like I was with the Chargers and then I signed with the Broncos, and it's kind of the same thing, right? You're on this one team, you're told we don't like the Broncos, and all of a sudden the Chargers release you, and kind of the same thing like transfer because of whatever situation, and you go to another team that is the team that is a rival. It's a team that's in the same division as you, and we know that world in NFL ranks, but we don't know it in college football. And it's incredibly awkward when you're in the NFL and you're playing your former team and all your friends and all that. But I feel like it's going to be even a different situation in college football. But this is going to be more the norm than it is not. It just feels like now that you can transfer within the SEC, because people that sign with the SEC schools in the first place, like they want to play in the best football conference.
Sure.
So you're going to see this more often. But it's incredibly unique, and I don't use that word lightly, but that's what it is. Because 5 years ago, if I would have told you LSU is going to have a freshman quarterback, he's going to start a handful of games, and at the end of that year, he's going to transfer to Auburn and going to be immediately eligible and potentially, try to fight for that job against Bo Nix, you would have said what?
I would have said, I don't know. I don't know what I would have said. I
probably would have been, you're crazy.
Yeah, I wouldn't have believed it. It just
Right.
it doesn't sound like it's unprecedented.
Yeah.
I have trouble. I'm sort of working through it like live, sort of, because I haven't sat down and digested it. But it's so different from what's been the precedent and what's been in place for the whole time I've been a college football fan
Right.
growing up. It's just not. It's not happened before. So I don't know. I think it's great for players. I think it's
Right.
great because I'm a guy that went to college, transferred, moved around, wasn't happy at a couple different spots. And when you're not happy at a place, or when you're not playing at a place, it takes a toll on you and you want the opportunity to go somewhere. And I am for college athletes having more freedom to move and to, make money off their name, image, and likeness and all that stuff that's sort of been the ceiling over their head. I'm for moving that ceiling up and treating them more like regular college students, basically. Right. And giving them the same rights as a coach, for example, to be able to move. I just see the complications too of like, hey, I'm here 1 year. One, it's going to open up the door to sort of the backdoor recruiting of,
Right.
hey, just because a kid's at a school doesn't mean that we have to stop talking to his people and try to get, there's that whole element that makes me a little nervous. And then there's the element of like, this guy was in our locker room for a year. Now he's going to a rival locker room. He knows things about our playbook. He knows things about. So I wouldn't say that I'm resistant to it. I just see the complications that emerge, and I wonder what the solutions are, or if there even are solutions.
Now, when it comes to, knowing the playbook, in TJ Finley's case, obviously new staff, new terminology, new playbook, that whole deal, but that's not always going to be the case, to your point. And I am like you. I am for the player. Like I want the player to be able to have success. If it's not working at one place and you're behind someone who is always going to be the starter and you want the opportunity to show your talents, I get it. But also I have a place in my heart that is deep in my heart for a guy like Matt Flynn. A guy like Matt Flynn doesn't happen in 2021. It just doesn't happen. A guy that knows he's good enough to be a starter, but he just so happens to be behind the number one pick in the NFL draft, JaMarcus Russell.
Yeah.
And he waits his turn. And when he waits his turn, he goes in his year as a starter, and we all know the story. He wins a national championship. I don't know if that happens. And in fact, it's probably never going to happen anymore in college football. So I understand both points of it. Now, the transferring and playing within your division, within your conference, that is very, very different, right? Because of all the things that you laid out. And there's that familiar face in recruiting, like you said, like that scares me.
Yeah.
Like the backdoor recruiting process of that, because look, the same 14 teams are all recruiting the same people. And if you can still have that relationship, what's really going on, that part makes me nervous. So there's so much change. And every time we catch up with Coach O on my show, I ask him this question. I'm like, Coach, there's so much going on. I mean, 6 things have changed since we talked to you last week. Like, who keeps up with all this? He's like, look, you just got to change. You got to evolve as it evolves, and you got to have these meetings with your coaches, because when it comes to recruiting and name, image, and likeness and what you can and can't do, I feel like for a long time, Cody, it was the same rules put in place. Right, wrong, or indifferent, it was the same rules. Now, it feels like something is always changing. You always got to stay on top of it. So I don't envy these coaches and their staff trying to figure out what exactly we can and can't do, what we should be doing. Is the other teams doing this? All the things that are going on.
It reminds me of Moore's law, which is I'm getting nerdy here. It's a law in like technology that basically says, like, what it literally means is that the size of a microchip on a computer cuts in half every year and its power doubles.
Right.
And so like this was a law that like somebody, I guess some guy named Moore, came up with in like the 60s and said by the time we're in 2020, your computer is going to be a phone, which is what we're looking at right now, right?
Yeah.
And people are going to be able to listen live on Spaces as we're talking about LSU football. And basically what it means is like the increase of technology is exponential. It
Right.
gets faster and faster every year. And that's the thing that stood out to me from Coach O when he was on y'all's show talking about this is he's never seen it evolve faster.
Nope.
And so you have to be more nimble than ever as a coach and as a staff. You have to have more support and support staff than ever before. And I think you just have to figure things out more on the fly than ever before. Like, we literally had a 2020 football season that was figured out on the fly last year in a pandemic. We're figuring out NIL on the fly right now. I think a lot of what we're doing in college athletics in general, and college football specifically, to bring it back home, is figuring it out as you go and being nimble and being able to adapt on the fly.
You have to.
Yeah.
Like you have to adapt. And these are big situations. Like, not only like do you have to adapt on the field, right? What was the old saying about LSU football for a decade? Like, it's 3 yards in a cloud of dust. They're not going to adapt, right? Like, that's part of adapting on the field, but it's also the other stuff. It's adapting off the field. You cannot be for it, but you better get on board, because everybody else is going to be on board, and you don't want to be left behind.
It's why, for example, to bring it back to the previous episode of Hey Fightin' Podcast, Jack Marucci is now your Director of Performance Innovation. You have to have forward-thinking people, because what I just said is like you're figuring out things on the fly. I mean, that kind of is what you're doing. So now you have to start thinking ahead. Yeah. What's the next thing that we're going to have to deal with? How can we get ahead of the curve? Eye tracking technology. Okay, that's going to help our receivers catch more balls. Injury prevention rather than injury treatment. You know, it's all these forward. So that as this exponential rate in college football changes faster than ever, you not only have to be able to be nimble and adapt on the fly, you have to be forward thinking. So it's funny that we started this conversation with TJ Finley and got to this point, but I think he specifically, and speaking of TJ Finley, had, if you look at it like objectively, one of the best true freshman seasons from a quarterback at LSU in recent years. Like, go back and find me a true freshman that won the games that he did, put up the numbers he did, which, to tie it into the conversation of who is back, speaks to the talent that you have in the quarterback quarterback year of this room with Myles Brennan, with Max Johnson, and then the new guy, Garrett Nussmeier. For a guy who had that productive of a season to leave and go seek greener pastures and more playing time speaks to the depth that LSU has at quarterback this year. So let's talk about these two guys, Max Johnson, Myles Brennan, and I'm going to frame the conversation for us. We are not the guys that are going to sit here and say, pound the table for, oh, it's Max's team. I want Max to start. Or, no, it's Myles' team. He's waiting his turn. I want him to start. That's not going to be us. It's just not it's not our style. Two, it's just not our perspective on things. Right. I think we just talk about what each guy brings to the table. And if you want to make a prediction on how you think it unfolds, that's fine. I hate making predictions because what ends up happening is people come back and point at your prediction and they're like, oh, nice prediction. You got that one wrong. Like one of the last times we were sitting here, I talked about how Trey Bradford was going to have a huge role in the running back room, and then he transferred like a week later. So I'm terrible at what I'm saying is I'm terrible at predictions, and I don't want to expose myself to that anymore. So, all right, let's start. Let's start with these two guys. And like I said before, I have a ton of numbers on Max and Myles from Pro Football Focus that I dug into this morning that actually were very illuminating for me. But before we get into the nerdy numbers talk, I want to talk from the football perspective. What you saw from those guys last year in their action on the field, and then what you saw from them in the spring. And I'll let you start with whoever you want to start with.
I'll start with Myles. Obviously, Myles has been here for a long time. You respect the way that he's gone about the process.
Matt Flynn in 2021, if you will.
It's like a unicorn, right? Yeah. He didn't take his ball and go home when he wasn't the starter. When Joe Burrow came in from Ohio State and won that job, he didn't transfer, right? He stayed the course, which I can respect, I can appreciate. When he played last year, he was really good. Averaged 375 yards a game a year ago. Like, when you look at the Mississippi State game and people are like, oh, he held on to the ball too long. That was his first start.
Yep.
Right. That's the first time you're going out there. And by the second half, a lot of that went away. Right. So, and plus he was playing catch up the whole game.
Yeah,
I mean, I think we can all say that.
And I'll say this now to interrupt you, and I'll let you continue. If you're going to do the numbers argument for Myles Brennan is really, really strong. We'll get into that in a second, but I just wanted to lay that groundwork for now. But
so
continue with your
you
Myles.
have a veteran quarterback. I realize it's not in games played because, as we mentioned, right, you wait your turn. But he's been around the program. He's been around the block. He's seen a lot of different things in college football. He worked really, really hard to come back from that injury. That was a very unique injury. There again, there's that word. I don't like to use it very often, but that was a unique injury that he had, one that nobody had ever really seen. And so he goes through that again. He's had so many hardships in his football career that he seems to always overcome or doesn't try to shy away from them, right? He hits them head on. And so you have that in Myles Brennan, a guy that waits his turn, plays well when he plays, gets hurt. And a little bit of you worries, okay, what's he going to be like that first time he takes a hit? But that's yet to be seen, right? Okay, and then you go and you fast forward and you look at Max Johnson. Max, when he first started to play last year, I always felt bad for him because it always seemed like it was like backed up on the 1 yard line, your own goal line to your back, and hey, lead us 99 yards.
Hey, true freshman, let's put you in the worst situation possible to get your feet wet.
Right.
Like, let's just throw you directly into the fire,
But he didn't seem panicked.
It sucked at the moment, and I think it's going to pay dividends long term. And you're right. He seemed very comfortable.
And obviously, we know who his father is. We know his dad won a Super Bowl. So he's been coached up through all of these moments throughout his life.
Big Bad Brett?
Right, exactly. It was fantastic TikTok videos. But look, nothing's going to be too big for him. And he showed that in his true freshman year. To go on the road, to go in the swamp, and your travel roster is like 50 people. Like Gordy Rush was real close to playing DB for LSU that night because the travel party was so small, right? And you go and you win that game. And you play really well winning that game. And then you come back and you outduel an Ole Miss offense that was as high-flying as anyone in the country. And you go score for score with them. There's a lot to like when it comes to Max Johnson because you don't see typically a true freshman have the attitude that he had. Like, okay, look, I'm going to the swamp. Cool story. Tell me what the next thing is. Like, nothing's going to be too big, again, for Max Johnson. And we always do this in any quarterback competition, and we talked about it on my show today with the Saints, with LSU. It always seems like without even being on the field, there starts to become a favorite, right? There starts to become, oh, this guy's got the buzz.
Yes.
And then 2 weeks from now, it might change. The other guy might get the buzz. It kind of feels like that's the territory that we're in. But I will say, with the new offensive coordinator, that kind of does hit reset on everything. Right, Coach Ensminger did a fantastic job with both these quarterbacks a year ago, but now Jake Peetz comes in, and it's going to be a different offense. So who does that favor? That's going to be the question all summer and all fall long. Like, okay, going into this position battle, I know that Jake Peetz likes RPOs, right? And that's not just a buzzword because everybody says it. When Jake Peetz got hired, I called my former head coach, Norv Turner, because Norv worked with Jake in Carolina. The first thing, Cody, he said was he's a mastermind at RPOs. First thing out of his mouth. Okay, so who does that favor? Well, you assume maybe that favors Max Johnson. But that's not to say that Myles Brennan can't improve in the RPO game, and things he does outside of the RPO game get him a leg up on this job. So there's a lot of ways we could sit here and we could break down both quarterbacks as far as we could talk ourselves into who could be the starter, who has a leg up. But I'll tell you this is the best quarterback room LSU football has probably had. It just has a complete group since you had JaMarcus, Matt Flynn, and Perriloux.
Yeah.
Right? You've got three guys that you feel really comfortable about. And look, the Joe Burrow, Myles Brennan one was a pretty damn good quarterback room, right? But this one has like a full depth of, you have your older veteran player, you have your sophomore who gained experience last year, and you have your young gun who was a 4-star guy who we saw in the spring game has a little bit of a gunslinger mentality. He's not scared to go in there and get his feet wet as well.
Yeah, and the key word there was room, quarterback room. Like, yes, Joe Burrow was the best quarterback in LSU history, probably college football history. Would you have him back in a heartbeat? Yes, but top to bottom, the depth of the room, the quality, I would guess the consistency of quality. I would say the consistency of quality between the first guy, the second guy, like whoever ends up winning, even the third guy, you feel very, very good about. The gap there is much smaller. The ceiling is pretty high. The floor is pretty high as well. So you feel good about those guys. So something you said sparked a thought in my head, and you were talking about how fans or even media types, us, latch on to their guy, right? All right, this guy is the guy. And so what I see the Max Myles conversation as it's been framed publicly, is really just like a Rorschach test. It says more about you as a fan, whichever guy you prefer, than it does about those guys specifically. And what I mean by that is you can make a compelling argument for either guy, but whatever argument you make is going to reflect what you value more than anything else. So, to get into the numbers, if you look at just the raw and advanced numbers, Myles Brennan is exceptional and was exceptional last year. And I mean Mac Jones, Kyle Trask levels of exceptional on just about every statistical category. And just about being the key word, because there's a couple that he wasn't quite there on. But for example, to dive into some of the advanced numbers, deep throwing, Myles Brennan, big arm, we know he can throw it downfield, was the second highest graded passer in the SEC on throws of 20-plus yards last year, 97.5 grade, only behind Mac Jones and just behind Mac Jones. In those 3 games, Myles was 10 of 19 for 325 yards, 6 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. The 2 interceptions were graded as non-turnover worthy plays. So basically, I remember one of them was like Mississippi State. They just threw it up at the end of the game. I don't remember what the other one was off the top of my head, but basically, when Pro Football Focus went back and charted it, they said, "Look, that's it's a pick on the stat sheet, but it's not really an interception."
Right.
The other number that stood out: 47.4% of his throws on deep balls were big time throws, which Pro Football Focus grades. It's more of a subjective scale, but that was second only to Felipe Franks. And again, 0 turnover worthy plays. That's exceptional. That is not Joe Burrow levels, but just beneath that. I mean, that is all SEC quarterback play on deep throws. I could give you another example. Against pressure, Myles Brennan had 122.0 NFL passer rating. Against the blitz, he had 141.0 NFL passer rating. That is all SEC to borderline All-American performance statistically. So if you value stats, advanced stats, a quarterback with a big arm, veteran presence, narrative, really, like there's a compelling narrative to Myles Brennan. Like you said, Matt Flynn stuck around behind all these guys. Myles Brennan stuck around, after playing a little bit as a freshman, waited for Joe to go, waited for his turn, got his turn, got hurt. Now he comes back. There's a great narrative there. If you value those things, you're going to love Myles Brennan.
Right.
But if you value youth and high ceilings, and if you value wins and losses and win-loss record, and, hey, who got the job done, if you value beating a top 10 team on the road, top 5 team on the road under pressure, if you value moxie, if you value some of the intangibles, you're going to love Max Johnson.
Right.
So, again, I can go more on numbers, but I think whatever happens here, LSU is going to have a very, very good to great quarterback if it's one of these 2 guys. And they're going to give you very, very different things, but be very, very effective at what they do. And so it's going to come down to fit, and it's going to come down to who performs in situations like the spring game and situations like fall camp. And it's going to come down to, hey, if I'm Jake Peetz and this is my decision, do I value this skill set, the tangible, proven statistical output? Do I value the athleticism, the escapability, the moxie, the high ceiling of a Max Johnson? That's a really tough decision, but you want your offensive coordinator to have tough decisions and not easy decisions when it comes to stuff like this, in my opinion.
And I know a question that has come in to our show, and I'm sure you get it as well, Cody, is can both of these quarterbacks play? I don't think you're going to have a case of that. I think it's truly going to be one quarterback or the other. And I say that because I just think that this staff wants a leader. They want a voice. They want the guy that they know is going to be in the huddle. They want the same voice. They want it to be consistent. And I talked about it with Jeremy Hill earlier today, because when you start playing 2 quarterbacks, well, this quarterback has a different cadence. This quarterback throws it different. I mean, you're talking about a left-handed quarterback or right-handed quarterback. This guy hands off the ball a little bit different. Like JaMarcus struggled when he first got to LSU because he would hit all of the running backs in our chest with the ball. I mean, almost get it up into your neck because he was so tall. He had to learn how to bend.
Yep.
Matt Flynn handed it off way different, just like, Marcus Randall handed it off different. And you always want to get a consistent look at it. Like, you want to know, okay, this is going to be this situation. I can expect this. Because when you're playing 2 quarterbacks, it's the old saying. Like, if you have 2, you don't have 1, right? Even though that's not the case at LSU, that saying plays because you're trying to figure out who the guy is, who's the voice, who's the leader, all those type of things. So I truly think this is going to be this is our quarterback, this is the backup. I don't think this bleeds into the season. It's just my own thought process, but just talking with Coach O every week, just talking with the staff, they want someone to go and take this job. Not just at this position, I would say the running back position as well, and I know we'll get into that, but they want to say, okay, we're going to UCLA, we're going to the Rose Bowl, this is our quarterback, he's the starter. Don't worry, don't hear your footsteps. You're not going to have a replacement if you don't score in your first 2 drives.
So let's individually look at each guy and highlight what they do well, because this goes back to a conversation I had with Jack Marucci last week on the podcast. He talked about, I want to focus, and this is from his perspective, as looking to, we were talking about basically their summer projects, right, and all the things they're doing this summer with each position group, and it goes back to the summer of 10,000 catches 2 summers ago where they did the eye tracking, and they were like, all right, let's find out what guys are good at and put them in spots to succeed and excel based on their strengths and skill sets, and let's work on their weaknesses away from the field, but let's really, really focus on the strengths and maximize those. So let's focus on the strengths of each of these guys. And I want to start with Myles. He's older, alphabetical order, whatever. I laid out the
seniority.
Yeah,
Okay.
Seniority.
Yeah,
So I laid out the deep ball stats.
Yep.
I'm gonna dive, and I laid out the pressure stats and all that stuff. What do I love about Myles Brennan? One, you love the arm talent. He can make any throw that you need him to make. Already pointed out the deep ball stats. He can zip it into tight windows. In those first 3 games last year, like I talked about the big time throws that Pro Football Focus charts earlier. You take a highlight reel of those first 3 games, and there's some exceptional throws in there. You love the age, and this is something that I don't think gets talked about a ton in college, especially compared to the NFL. Like in the NFL and especially the NBA, you're always thinking about age and how this guy is going to develop. There's a real advantage to being an old dude in college football. Like there is, especially the quarterback position. The biggest, and we'll talk about this when we talk about Max. There's a pretty significant, not a pretty significant gap. There's a gap between Myles' advanced stats and Max's. Myles are better.
Yeah.
But there is a very significant gap between older players' advanced stats and younger players' advanced stats. Joe Burrow's advanced stats in 2018, when he was 1 year less experienced, were okay, but not great, but took a huge leap the next year. Same was true for Danny Etling. In 2016, his advanced stats were okay. 2017, they took a big leap. Guys, shocking. I know I'm saying something really brand new and bringing something new to the conversation. They get better.
Right.
But especially at the quarterback position, there is a real learning curve to overcome. And so when you look at it in that context, and we'll talk about Max in a second, his numbers are actually pretty good for a guy that was thrown into the fire. But you love that Myles is experienced. You love that he's going to be older, smarter, more poised than just about any guy that he faces on the other side on the defense. And that gives you a Joe Burrow-like advantage. It gives you a maturity advantage. I love Myles' leadership. You were just talking about a guy taking over the locker room and controlling the locker room. We saw that from Myles going into the 2019 season. You remember Coach O talking about that when it was clearly Joe's team, okay?
Right.
And Joe was clearly the starter, poised for a great season. And Coach O was like, Myles is really leading this team well, and was the perfect consummate backup professional,
Right.
and then really took the reins after Joe left and showed exceptional leadership all the way up to last season. Then he gets hurt. What does he do? He keeps leading. He's out there working with Max. He's out there cheering the guys on the sideline. He was just in, and so you love that. I've talked a lot about tangibles with Myles. That's an intangible that you love. I'll flip it to you. I'll pass the ball to you now. What do you see in Myles Brennan? What are the positives that if you're Jake Peets and you're sitting there like, I can win with this guy? What are the skill sets that you're looking at?
Well, it is the first thing that jumps off is the arm talent. And I know that's kind of become a cliche word, but it is. Look, when you're an offensive coordinator, you know what your routes are. You know that you're going to have a lot of different concepts and combinations, and this guy can make all the throws, right? He can do that. He's not going to panic in the pocket would be another one because he has been around for a long time. Like that plays a long way for me. And so like the veteran part of it, that goes a long way. The fact that I know his mentality is not one to be a quitter, right? Because of what he did, the way he stayed. I know he's gone through some injuries. Like, is that a big concern? I don't know that. That's probably an internal conversation because we know he had something in 2019. We know he had something obviously last year as well. But when you look at his makeup and his mental makeup and always being there, always being accessible to his team and his players, that goes a long way. It's not to say Max doesn't have it, but we have seen Myles do that throughout his career. And again, when he got his shot, he played well. Like, he played really well. Like, we're breaking down the numbers here. And we can sit here and we can argue, okay, well, who do you do it against? Vanderbilt, Mizzou, which are those teams. Well, Mississippi State, that defense ended up being pretty good, right? That defense actually played really well and did a lot of good things. And so I don't like to get in that conversation. I think Myles handled his business when he had to. There's a lot to like there. It's a good situation, the fact that we could sit here and it's not like who's going to win this job because you got to have somebody play this position. It's who's going to win this job because both these guys have a lot of skill sets that you like, but which one's going to win out?
What I like about the Mississippi State game, and that's I'll point out a couple false arguments. One false argument is Myles wasn't good against Mississippi State. Myles was struggled against Mississippi State for 3-4 series. I don't remember how it was until about the middle of the second quarter. And then he was lights out the rest of the game. Like, the numbers speak for themselves. Yeah. Go look at it. He was lights out the rest of the game. They figured out something schematically. They figured out an adjustment to make. They made the adjustment. They got him a little more time. And he figured out how to buy himself more time. And he was lights out the rest of the game. And then was lights out for the rest of the way. Another false argument, and this will probably pivot the conversation to Max, is, well, Myles is the older guy, so you play him, and then you've got Max for 2 or 3 more years, and you play him, and there's that nice hierarchy of succession. It's beautiful. Like, I love the mathematics of it. It adds up. If you're like a football general manager, like, it appeals to that part of the brain. It's just not reality. Right. Because if I'm Jake Peets, I want to win now. Yeah. I want to win today. And so if I feel Max Johnson gives me a better chance to win, I'm playing Max Johnson today. I'm not doing this thing. Well, he's slightly better than Myles, but because he's younger and he's going to be around him. No, it's if they think he's better, they're going to play him. So, we've talked about Myles. I want to pivot it to Max a little bit and talk about what I love about Max Johnson. And there's a lot to love about Max Johnson. I think the biggest difference, and we're talking about differentiators, is his legs. I think that's pretty clear. While you're talking and responding, I forgot to look up the rushing stats, but I remember off the top of my head, like, the difference in scrambles for first downs is just it's pretty significant. Myles doesn't have that in his game as much as Max, and that's nice. That's nice. If I'm an offensive coordinator, it's nice to have that bailout. That was really, to me, one of the things that made Joe Burrow so special is how good he was with his legs to either avoid pressure, navigate the pocket, or get you a free first down. It was like, I go to the SEC championship game where he makes the throw out of the pocket to the right to Justin Jefferson coming, it's his second Heisman play or whatever. And I remember how many times I pictured myself being a defensive coordinator coaching against Joe Burrow and being like, I dialed up the perfect play, the perfect scheme. My guys executed it to the 99th percentile of perfection. They just didn't bring the quarterback down because he was better than us. And I can't do anything more. Like, my hands are tied as a defensive coordinator. Joe made that feeling a lot, and I think Max has that same ability to, man, we dialed up the perfect scheme. We covered their guys perfectly. The pressure was there, but he's just a little nimble, a little too athletic, a little too poised, gets a free first down. So I like that about him. Obviously, what you like about Max is what he did in the last 2 games to win you 2 games. And it's almost a double-sided coin for me, because Bill Connolly, who writes for ESPN, did a column at the end of last season. It was college football's luckiest and unluckiest teams in 2020. And the lead to the story was about LSU beating Florida. Yeah. And, Bill's a big advanced stats guy. Florida had a 99.4% chance of winning that game based on the box score stats and the play-by-play data. They win that game 994 times out of 1,000. But LSU figured out a way to win that 6 in 1,000 chance. They figured out a way. So that tells me 2 things. One, that's not sustainable. You're not going to win a lot of football games like that. But it also tells me that kid that was playing quarterback that day has the ability to win you the 6 in 1,000 opportunity. And that's harder to quantify, but I think it's the intangible that we all saw watching him and that comfort we had watching him, even though he was a true freshman. Like, man, this kid has something different.
So when you watch Max Johnson, you're going to, look at, does he throw the 18-yard dig route like it's supposed to be thrown? Does it have some zip on it? Is it the tight spiral, all that stuff? To me, that doesn't matter with him because it still gets there. Like, the 18-yard dig route still gets there. It just might look a little different, which is okay. And you start talking about some of the rushing abilities that he has, not only on the design runs, obviously, which we saw, but just to be able to pick up that free first down and to know when it's 3rd and 7, you almost have that Tim Tebow feeling back in the day of he's going to get 8 yards, isn't he? He's going to find a way to get 8 yards. You're going to have everything covered up, to your point. You're going to have everything locked up, but he's going to find a way to rush for 8 yards and get you that first down. We saw it in the Florida game. We saw them, call design plays where you have the option to run if it's not there and pick up first downs to get LSU in field goal territory, right? And so there's so much to like when it comes to what he can do and the savvy that he has in the pocket. And that's also saying knowing when to run. There's a lot of quarterbacks that have, jets, and they can find a way to pick up a first down with their legs, but they do it at the wrong times.
Yep.
They escape a pocket that is too good to be escaping, step up in that pocket, make the throw down the field. And he showed it and really grew within the season, from the A&M game to the Alabama game to the Florida game, and of course to the Ole Miss game, the games he played in. He showed that he got more comfortable in the pocket. And it's really, when you start talking about the differences, how much is that going to be a point of emphasis for LSU this year to be able to have that in their repertoire, to have that in their playbook? What do you value more? Do you value the quarterback that can probably make every single throw in your playbook? Do you value the quarterback that grew up in the RPO game, that has the ability to be a threat to really pull that RPO? Because there's different versions, and most people listening right now know that there's different versions of an RPO. Obviously, you can hand it to the running back. Obviously, you can throw that slant behind the linebacker. Obviously, an aspect of it that you don't see a ton is I can pull this ball. If you crash on the running back, I can pull this and I can make my quarterback a true runner. And he has that ability, not just like because we're going to do it to try to trick you because you don't think we're going to. No, I have the ability that is a real threat that you have to account for. So that aspect of it obviously is the thing that you like the most about him. And he does have that I'm going to find a way effect to him. So many times in that Florida game, that Ole Miss game, it seemed like it just wasn't going to happen. And because of his athletic ability and because of the calm he had, he was able to do it. So for me, it's and we don't know this yet because we don't know what Jake Peetz is going to be. We don't know which one he values more. So it's really going to come down to the perfect fit, to your point.
So while you were talking, I pulled up the rushing numbers. So last year, Max had 19 scrambles on running plays for 101 yards. Yeah. Myles had 5 for 15. So there's a gap there. Max had 4 runs of 10+ yards. Myles had 0. Myles picked up 1 first down with his legs. Max picked up 14. So that's a distinguishing factor. Now, all that said, if you're the offensive coordinator and Max is in, you're gonna put him in a position to succeed. You're going to use his legs. Myles is in. You're not going to rely on his legs so much. So to me, that's not necessarily a put this guy ahead of this guy argument. It's more different strokes, different folks, how it fits. So I went into the deep dive numbers with Myles. I want to do it with Max now. And I want to, again, caveat this, and I alluded to it earlier and probably said it pretty clearly, but I want to say it clearly again. His numbers aren't as good as Myles in most cases. There's a couple areas where they're basically the same, throwing the ball. But that is very, very standard for the young quarterback versus the vet quarterback. And to be even more specific, Max's numbers on some of these categories that aren't as good as Myles are very, very good for a true freshman. So I wanted to put that caveat out there. Deep throws. We talked about Myles earlier, one of the better in the SEC. Max wasn't as successful there. He was only 5 of 17, did have 3 touchdowns, and 17.6% big-time throws, compared to Myles, which was 47.4%. So Myles was much more likely a year ago, as a more experienced quarterback, but with a bigger arm, to make that deep throw down the field. Against pressure, we talked about Myles' numbers. He had 22.0 NFL rating. Max's was only 61.9. He was 16 of 40, 174 yards, a touchdown, 65.5% adjusted completions. Myles was about 76.7. Now, here was an interesting one to me. And again, it goes to the legs. Against pressure, 17.6% of the time that Myles was pressured, he was sacked. Max was only sacked 14.5% of the time, so it's not a huge gap. And so that's probably a credit to Myles and his ability to get rid of the ball, not taking a ton of sacks, but it shows a little more elusiveness. Now, The pressure stats in particular are where you see massive, massive growth from year 1 to year 2. It happened with Burrow. It happened with Etling. It happened with Brandon Harris. Every guy that LSU's had that I have these numbers on, and really every guy that's in the SEC, basically from year 1 to year 2, if you're a good quarterback, there's a big jump there. Where you can kind of see consistency is from a clean pocket. Most guys are who they are from a clean pocket from year 1 to year 2. There's not a ton of growth there. Now with Joe, it was on a different level, but Joe is not the guy you can compare to. Usually what you do in the clean pocket as a first-year starter, pretty similar to what you do in the second year, third year. There's going to be some growth, but it's not a huge jump. I haven't given Myles clean pocket stats yet, and I did that on purpose. So Myles in a clean pocket last year was 57 of 93. That's 61%. 678 yards, 7 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. Now, he had a bunch of drops, 12 drops. Okay, 12 drops in 93 attempts. So his adjusted completion percentage is actually 78.4 compared to 61.3. So there's a big jump there with the drops. And his NFL rating was 99.7. Again, that doesn't include the drops. So if some of those balls are caught, those numbers are better. Max was 72 of 110, so 65.5%, a little bit ahead of Myles. 895 yards, 7 touchdowns, 1 interception, 76.1% adjusted, 108.0 NFL rating. He only had 11 drops in 110 attempts versus 12 drops. So they both had a bunch of drops go against them. So when you take out the drops, okay, let's get them on the same level. Clean pocket, Myles is 2% more accurate adjusted percentage-wise, but had a few more drops than Max. You could say that's bad luck. You could also say that Max throws a really, really catchable football. So clean pocket, the difference between these guys is not drastic. In fact, it's pretty similar. The big difference was that Myles was much more comfortable versus pressure versus the blitz than Max, who, as most true freshman quarterbacks, needed a little more help there. But as the season went on, you saw that comfort level grow with Max. You saw him get more comfortable there. So all that to say, the numbers favor Myles.
Yeah. But I thought it would be a bigger gap, to be honest with you. Full disclosure, before you said that, I just assumed with a clean pocket, what do you go with? Well, you go with the guy that's got the arm, the guy that can make all the throws. That is surprising to me, to be honest.
And so if you index it for age, if you index it for expectation, it probably levels the playing field quite a bit. And, to kind of wrap up the conversation with these two guys, Max did go 2-0 down the stretch. And it was 2 games. I mentioned the 99.4% chance that LSU had of losing that game against Florida. He also did the Ole Miss game, and I just had it pulled up here, and I'm trying to find it. The Ole Miss game was only a 27% post-game win expectancy for LSU, but they found a way again, and he made big plays down the stretch. So all that to say this, I don't envy Jake Peets for having to, and Coach O and that whole staff for having to decide between these two if that is who they're deciding between, because there's a guy who we haven't talked about yet that's pretty good as a true freshman. But if it comes down to those two, I don't envy them for having to decide between them. But there have been many an offensive coordinator at LSU that wishes they had this dilemma between, I get to pick between the strong-armed veteran quarterback who put up insane numbers, both raw and advanced, in his first 3 starts last year and has tons of experience, or I get to pick the young, athletic, nimble guy with moxie and confidence and never looks phased at all. That's my choices. Like, sign me up for that would be their answer to that. So all that to say, I'll leave it to the listener to decide, and like I said, the Rorschach test, impose your own belief system and pick your guy, because that's part of the fun of being a fan, really, is those attachments. It's a good spot to be in for LSU, and I'm excited. I'm excited to see how it unfolds. I'm excited to see what Jake Peets does to make these guys fit.
The one thing, kind of my final thing, that I really didn't think of before we started talking about this position battle today, when you look at the game that Max got run in, like the ones he truly got run in, at Auburn, at Texas A&M, against Alabama, at Florida, were 4 of those games. Like, the opponent matters too. And that's not something I've really heard brought up when it comes to Max Johnson. Yeah, he played this game, but nobody really talks about where he was at. And I realize pandemic crowds were not the crowds that they're going to be, but still, being in that stadium, being the team that everybody's rooting against and not having home field advantage and all of those things, he played in some difficult places, right? And then he played against the national champion in Alabama. And look, the Ole Miss defense is what it is, but still, to outscore Matt Corral in that offense, like who he put those numbers that we keep throwing out there against, that might be the most impressive thing of all of it.
Yeah. I have an adversity bias. I love guys that have battled adversity. I think adversity is completely underrated. Like, unless you're just a million times more talented than everyone else, which I think LSU is going to be one of the more talented teams in the country, but the gap between whatever LSU is and the team that's less talented right below them is not that significant. I love teams that have overcome adversity, that have dealt with it, that have had their character reinforced by it. You could say that for either of these guys. With Myles and his journey to where he is now, with Max being the third string guy going into last year, losing the quote-unquote battle with TJ Finley that week going into the South Carolina game where, it was down to those two guys with Myles out, being thrown into the fire on the road in multiple situations but always looking poised. Both of these guys have dealt with a ton of adversity. And so if they're in a tough spot this year, I feel good about either of them. Whichever one doesn't win the job to start the season, I feel good about him because I feel like if his opportunity does come, and it very well may,
absolutely,
he will be ready. So really good spot for LSU to be in quarterback-wise. Let's talk about one more guy who's new, Garrett Nussmeier. And we'll probably talk a little more spring game here than we have so far because that's the only thing we've seen from him. And I could talk about his spring game stats. I don't want to really do the spring game stat thing, though.
Yeah.
I think we saw in Garrett Nussmeier in that spring, though, like from the eyeball test, not the stat test, a lot of talent.
Yeah.
Maybe as talented a freshman arm as has come in here, the ability to throw on platform, off platform. We saw typical freshman impulse control issues, like just not being able to see a linebacker dropping in coverage that wasn't there in high school, or to adjust to the athleticism. But you saw a ceiling at quarterback that's really, really intriguing, and I'm excited to see. And a guy that starts the year probably making assumptions here, so if I'm wrong, I'm sorry, probably is your number 3 guy.
Yeah.
But if he was your number 2 guy, even as a true freshman, I mean, me personally, I feel pretty good about that.
Yeah, you played 2 true freshmen a year ago. College football has changed. 10 years ago, playing a true freshman was absolutely like doomsday situation. No way you can win football games. But with the growth of 7-on-7 and summer camps and all of that, you've seen almost every coverage that you can see. So you see quarterbacks ready to play from the get-go way more than you've ever really seen in college football. So I agree with you there. And also, going back to the spring game, he's at LSU, but he's supposed to be at prom. Like, he came early. Like, he enrolled early and went through that process. So he's not even a freshman. I mean, he's a high school senior out there playing against, the likes of Derek Stingley and some of the best defensive backs in the country. So, yeah, I'm not going to look at stats and maybe decision-making. I'm going to look at how do you look as far as throwing, 15-yard out. How do you look throwing it over the top, all those type of things, which from, only the one opportunity we had to see him, you can see why he was so highly recruited. Does he have to get better on the things that they disguise and were able to get him throwing interceptions? Yeah, right? Just because they're playing man-free on this coverage and they're showing you man-free this time, well, they're disguising it. That linebacker's going to be in that window he wasn't in the last look that you got. That, to you, looked exactly the same. But guess what? These college coaches, they do a pretty good job, and they make a living confusing quarterbacks. And so all of that stuff will come with growth.
Got a little personality to him, too, which I like. Yeah. I like that he's got kind of that Texas high school quarterback, like, confidence and swagger to him. I think that's an intangible that has a lot of value. So I'm excited for his future. I hope that he's not needed this season, just because that means that one of the other 2 guys has stayed healthy, they've performed well, and then he can kind of have that season to develop because he's got a really high ceiling, does some nice things with his feet, great arm, great kind of just quarterback skills that take a while to develop, throwing off platform, improvising. I think he's got a lot of that in his locker, which I really like. So excited to see where he goes. Okay.